dramatic shots, vintage labs, fake skull close-ups, whispering voices. Voiceover. In 1912, England, scientists found the missing link between humans and apes. But the truth was a shocking lie. How did it start? A tea-stained skull, a world desperate for answers, and one very lucky forger. It all started with a man named Ye Shin Jia. He wanted more than anything to be famous. And in 1912, there was no better way to do that than to make a sensational scientific discovery. You see, scientists had been arguing for decades over this thing called evolution. Some thought humans evolved from apes, but others weren't so sure. The truth is, we still don't know for sure. But by 1912, scientists had found a lot of fossils that hinted at the idea that we did evolve from apes. They just needed the missing link, some creature that showed the transition from ape to human. And one day, a man named Charles Dawson claimed to have found exactly that. Now, Charles was a regular guy. He wasn't even a scientist. But when he came across a strange skull while walking his dog along a riverbank, he knew he had something special. See, Charles worked at a company that made bricks near a famous prehistoric site called the Piltdown. So he brought the skull to some friends who worked there excavating fossils. After a few days, they finally wrote back to him with their analysis. It seemed to confirm his suspicions. This skull was indeed something special. But here's the twist. The skull was totally fake. Charles had actually bought it a few months earlier from a guy known only as the Professor, who was a well-known forger. He had hoped to sell it to a museum for a pretty penny. Still, though, the fact that Charles had no idea the skull was fake makes this story way more interesting. Let me explain. You see, Charles brought the skull to a scientist named Arthur Smith Woodward. Arthur took one look at it and told Charles that he believed it was part of a new species of human ancestor. That might sound unbelievable today, but back then it would have been impossible for anyone to know for sure. There wasn't much understanding of genetics yet, and DNA wasn't discovered until 1953. So scientists relied on physical evidence like bone structure to try to piece together the evolutionary history of humans. This meant that sometimes people could come to very different conclusions about what the fossil record actually said. Still, most scientists agreed that any new discovery would be a big deal. And that's why when Arthur announced his discovery of the Piltdown Man, the world of science went wild. Of course, this was also huge news for Charles Dawson, who got to be famous for finding the missing link, or at least part of it. You see, the skull that Charles found was definitely human, but the jawbone looked much more ape-like. This was exactly what scientists were looking for. Perhaps this was the creature that bridged the gap between apes and us. Charles was famous for a moment, and the Piltdown Man became one of the most important fossils ever found. Scientists studied it for decades, even making plaster casts of it so they could study the original in London without damaging it. That is until 1953. That's when scientists finally figured out how to date rocks using carbon-14 atoms. Before that, there was no real way to tell how old a fossil was. They could only estimate based on the layers of dirt they found it in. So it was assumed that the deeper down you found a fossil, the older it was. It was an educated guess at best. But if scientists didn't know how old the fossils were, they couldn't know for sure if they were the missing link either. But in 1953, everything changed. Scientists could now determine the age of fossils accurately. And the first thing they did was put the Piltdown Man to the test. And it didn't take long for them to realize that it was a fake. The skull was real, but the jawbone turned out to be only about 500 years old, meaning it couldn't possibly be our missing link. Suddenly, everyone was asking the same question. How did the world's greatest scientists get fooled? Well, that's where things get really interesting. We can never know for sure why they fell for the forgery, but scientists have put forward some pretty good theories. Now, before we dive into those theories, I want to ask you the same question. Why do you think they fell for it? Comment your best theory below. The best comment will get a dedicated video about it. So let's go through each of these theories one by one, starting with theory number 1. Theory 1. A plot to disgrace Darwin's evolution. As I mentioned earlier, when Charles found the skull, scientists were still debating whether or not evolution was true. Some believed it, some didn't. And this debate was more divisive than any other scientific debate in history. Charles himself was clearly anti-evolution, and there were plenty of other anti-evolution folks out there too. So the theory goes that someone created the Piltdown man specifically to cast doubt on the theory of evolution. By presenting the world with a fossil that seemingly disproved evolution, they could turn the tide against Darwin's theory. Now this theory has some holes in it. For example, if this was a hoax, why did the forger give it to Charles Dawson, a known anti-evolutionist? Wouldn't he have given it to a pro-evolutionist so that they would be the one to discredit it? Well, maybe he did. Maybe the forger gave it to Charles hoping he would bring it to a pro-evolutionist scientist who would try to use it to support evolution rather than disprove it. In the end, it doesn't really matter. If this was a plot to discredit evolution, it failed. The discovery of the Piltdown man actually helped to further prove that humans did evolve from apes. Yes, you heard that right. Despite being a fake, this fake fossil actually helped to prove that evolution was real. Here's how. You see, at the time, scientists thought that the missing link had to look exactly like a mix between an ape and a human. They thought it would have a small brain and ape-like teeth and jaws. But when they analyzed the Piltdown man, they realized that the brain was actually pretty large and that the teeth and jaw looked more like a human's than an ape's. This made them question their assumptions. Maybe the missing link didn't look like a mix between an ape and a human. Maybe it looked more like a human. So instead of helping to disprove evolution, the Piltdown man helped to prove it. But unfortunately, it wasn't the only thing it helped to prove. It also helped to prove that scientists were sometimes gullible. Theory number 2. Was it aliens? Okay, maybe that's not a theory that scientists put forward, but I'm putting it forward now. Consider this. In 1912, the idea of aliens was a lot less popular than it is today. We hadn't discovered any planets beyond our own solar system yet. We would not discover the first one until 1992, and we hadn't even seen a single UFO yet. Well, we don't officially. Anyway, this means that when Charles brought the skull to Arthur, the idea that an alien species could have existed in prehistoric times was basically unheard of. This brings up two questions. 1. Would scientists even believe in aliens if they had been presented with the option? And 2. Could aliens have provided the perfect forgery? Well, the answer to the first question is probably yes. Most scientists at the time were religious and believed in God. But that didn't mean they couldn't believe in extraterrestrials. After all, God created the universe, which included other planets. So it's entirely possible that God could have also created life on those planets. Now, the second question is a little harder to answer. Could aliens have provided the perfect forgery? Well, that depends on whether or not they're better at forging skulls than humans are. And I think we can safely assume that if aliens exist, they probably are. But regardless of whether you think aliens were involved, it's clear that there's only one conclusion we can come to. The scientists of 1912 were wrong. The Piltdown man was a fake, but they weren't stupid. They were simply victims of circumstance. They just didn't have the tools necessary to date fossils, so they had to rely on indirect methods. They also didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They didn't know any more than we did at the time. All they had were their brains and their intuition. And that was enough for them to change the world. Quick cuts mock comments like, "Scientists were naive," or "Follow the money."